Well, thank you, Kevin. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take things a little bit of a different direction. Kevin was addressing a lot of the physical aspects of fatigue. And what I want to do is dive into the sleep-related aspect now, because generally speaking, when we're done at the end of the day, whether it's physical exertion or cognitive exertion, ideally, if our jobs are well designed, what's going to happen is we're going to go home at the end of the day, we're going to go to bed, and we're going to get some sleep. And that sleep should, in fact, prepare us for the next day. Now, we're going to have a problem if we don't get adequate restorative sleep. And that's what's going to result in decreased capacity throughout the next day in terms of us being able to perform mentally or physically. So it really comes down to, are we getting the restorative sleep that we need to counteract the efforts we did the day before? So if we don't get enough sleep, then what's going to happen is we're going to have fatigue that continues to accumulate. It's going to build and build and build. And there's nothing you can do about it except get sleep. Sleep is the only thing that cures fatigue. You cannot Starbuck it away. You certainly cannot Red Bull it away. Those will not eliminate the fatigue that is building in your body. And the thing is, if we don't address that sleep issue, we're going to see it manifest into short and long-term effects in terms of our physical health, our mental health, and even our emotional status. So if we look at it from a drowsiness perspective, this is a little bit different. Drowsiness is not the same as fatigue. Drowsiness is that feeling of sleepiness, that overwhelming feeling often, that's usually accompanied by a lack of energy. Now, drowsiness, unlike fatigue, drowsiness is something that fluctuates throughout the day, and we can temporarily mask drowsiness. So here's where a cup of coffee can help us out, or an engaging conversation. Those things can help mask the drowsiness temporarily. But the reality is, if you have any sleep debt built up in you, you have fatigue that keeps on building. And that fatigue, the more fatigue you have, the more intense and the more frequent those drowsy episodes are going to be. Now, the consequences of that is that we're going to see drowsiness affect us in a real-time aspect. So if you have a drowsy episode and you are operating a piece of equipment, or you're behind the wheel of something, or you're doing a safety-sensitive task, here's where drowsiness can lead towards a tragic outcome. So we need to really understand a little bit of the science behind the cognitive side of fatigue. So I just want to introduce the sleep-wake cycle. And really what this comes down to is we have two things going on in our body, what we call gene expressions that are driving our need for sleep. The first is what we call the homeostasis sleep drive. And very simply put, what this means is the longer we're awake, the more waste products build up in our brain, and the tireder we become. And we know that generally speaking, once we get to around being awake for 16 or 17 hours of just straight wakefulness, we're going to start feeling overwhelming feelings of sleepiness and this desire to go to bed. At the same time, we have the circadian drive, and the circadian drive is all about our exposure to light, and in particular, sunlight being the most positive drive we have. And what that does is it makes us more alert as the sun goes up higher in the sky. Functionally, we can perform better. Cognitively, we're more aware of everything, and everything works out great until the sun goes down in the sky. And then at that point, combined with our homeostasis sleep drive, we end up going to bed. Now, all this means is that we are a 24-hour diurnal species. What that actually means is that every day we have light exposure throughout the course of the rotation of the planet. And depending on the amount of light exposure we get, that light is going to filter in through our eyes and go back to this portion of our brain called the master clock, or our suprachiasmatic nucleus. The master clock is in charge of controlling all of our rhythms in our peripheral clocks. So we have clocks throughout our body and in our different tissues, our organs, and the brain will try to harmonize all of its direction with these peripheral clocks so that everything is working in harmony. It'll tell things like, okay, pancreas, I need you to release insulin. Okay, kidneys, I need you to shut down now because we're trying to go to sleep here. So all of these rhythms have to work in harmony with each other for us to stay in a healthy state. But if we have light exposure at the wrong time, or too much light exposure at the wrong time, it can desynchronize a lot of these rhythms. Now, one of the ways that we can also help keep these rhythms in check is by making sure we have a lot of routine in our lives. So routine comes in the form of what we call our exogenous factors. In other words, when you have light exposure, when you eat, when you go to bed, when you exercise, when you socialize, the more consistent our daily routines are, the stronger the harmony between these rhythms and the stronger the link between them so that they will not go through this jet lag effect. All right. So the reality of our species when it comes to understanding cognitive fatigue, and especially as it relates to shift work, is that we are a day-oriented species. That means we will always do our best quality of work during the bright daytime hours, and we will always get our best quality and quantity of recuperative sleep during the deepest, darkest nighttime hours. In other words, the reality of our species is we are not nocturnal, which means we cannot change your gene species and we cannot adapt to night shift. In fact, the most recent literature out there is stating that less than 3% of those who work on even a permanent night shift schedule will ever see any kind of significant adaptation. So that's not a lot of people. And on top of that, if we think we're adapted, because a lot of people think they have adapted to night shift, they really just adapted to a state of impairment. And it's what we call a deviance of normal. So no, they haven't truly adapted to working night shift. They are just working at an impaired state. And the more consecutive night shifts we work, the harder it's going to be to synchronize. So sleep is certainly one of the issues that we're concerned about. And it's really a societal problem right now, not just a work problem. So, for example, we've got a couple of surveys that were done, and in Canada and the U.S., we found that approximately 3/4 of the population are not meeting the minimum requirements of 7 hours or more of sleep. Between 7 to 9 is what every adult typically needs. So we're seeing a huge impact on the amount of sleep that we're getting, and that is going to translate into all kinds of cognitive and performance impairments. So basically, when we continuously cut back on our sleep, which so many of us do for various reasons, one of the first things we're going to see is an impact on our ability to recognize the situation around us, to identify hazards in our immediate area. So that loss of situational awareness can play out in a very negative manner. We have a tendency to spend more time on task when we're tired. And that's not always a blessing. Sometimes it's a blessing because the brain will actually encourage us to take more time to make a right decision as opposed to making a quick wrong decision. But that's only going to be of benefit if time is on our side. If it's an emergency situation you're in, then you don't have the luxury of time. We also know that the more sleep deprived we are, the more we underestimate risk. And not only do we underestimate risk, but we have a greater tolerance for accepting risk. We know that our logic is flawed in terms of our decision-making capabilities or just recognizing how dangerous a situation may be. We have hindered visual perception. The eyes are dramatically affected when we're in a tired state to the point that it can affect visual acuity, depth perception, and even hand-eye coordination. We know that there are problems with our problem-solving skills. We have slowed information processing, reduced reaction times, and even decreased learning abilities. These are only some of the impairments that have been noted scientifically. What we need to do is start to recognize how these impact us at the job site in terms of performance. I would assume that most jobs require one, two, or several of these different elements that are listed here. And this is what we have to start doing. We have to start connecting the dots between performance and fatigue. So, for example, some great research done on police officers. And when we compare tired officers to their performance capabilities, what they discovered is that the more tired they were, the more that the officers were going to rely on more aggressive forms of control and to use perhaps excessive force where it's not warranted. We also found that within the research, they were stating that the people who are going to court, the police officers, were being ill-prepared for court. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're putting in long hours, or maybe they're coming off of a night shift, and now they have to go and show up at court. And court doesn't care if they've only had 1 or 2 hours of sleep. You're scheduled for court, you have to be there. So they're often not prepared, and that, of course, has a big impact on our judicial system. And then we have recognition that there's a lot more errors on paperwork with cops that are tired. And that makes sense. I mean, the more tired we are, the more functional limitations we have, and especially if you're doing a lot of your paperwork at the end of your shift, which is very typical with police work. We also know that tired cops have a lot more citizen complaints issued against them. And again, because perhaps they're not as approachable, they have lower tolerance levels, and they just don't play as nice as we would hope they would. And on top of that, we see, again, that impairment with the eyes. The hand-eye coordination is dramatically affected with tired cops. And that's a little disturbing when you consider that they actually have weaponry in their hands. As another example, we can look at the medical schools, and a great study done at Harvard by Dr. Charles Eisler. And what he determined was that those interns who were scheduled for at least 24 consecutive hours, when they were looking at impacts on performance, they found that the odds of stabbing themselves with a needle stick or a scalpel increased by as much as 61%, which is a little disconcerting if your needle has just been stuck into somebody with some kind of disease that you don't want. They also found the risk of motor vehicle collisions on the drive home after these schedules increased by 168%, and a risk of a near miss increased 460%. Now, that near miss could be in a variety of situations. It could be while they're driving. It could be in the disbursement of medications, maybe the wrong dosage, or maybe the wrong medication entirely. So what these studies are showing us is that we have to start making that link between performance and fatigue, because in lieu of not making that distinction, then we have organizations that really don't understand if they have a fatigue problem, and they don't see the need for addressing fatigue. And it comes down to this: impaired is impaired. And this is research that dates back to 1997 with the primary study that really brought this to the forefront. And what the Australians were able to quantify was the amount of impairment if you compare fatigue impairment versus blood alcohol equivalency. And what they found is that if you're awake for just 17 hours, you are now at a blood alcohol equivalency of 0.05% impairment. And if you're awake for around 20 to 21 hours, you are reaching levels of 0.08 impairment. And if you get up to 24 hours, you are actually reaching 0.10. Now, once we start getting past 0.08 or up to 0.10, we're really looking at somewhere around the area of a 40% drop in alertness. So we really have to understand that we are operating in fatigue states when we have long work hours, or we're not getting the amount of sleep that we require before we return to work the next day. And I think this is one of the most important slides that I can show you. And this is a wonderful study that was done by Hans van Dongen. And what he was able to show is that he took 3 groups of people. One group was allowed 8 hours time in bed, one group was allowed 6 hours, and one group was allowed 4 hours. And they were kept on that sleep schedule for 14 days in a row. And using objective measures, what they call PVT, psychomotor vigilance testing, they would put them through these tests, and they discovered, and it makes sense, that by the 14th day in a row of being restricted in your sleep, we would see increases in errors, or what they call performance lapses. So much so that the group that only had 4 hours time in bed every night were up around the 17 mark. And those who had 6 hours time in bed were up around the 10, 11 mark. Now, what's interesting, at the same time that he did the objective study, he also did a subjective study, asking the participants to evaluate their own level of sleepiness and how they think they were performing. And these were their results, what they thought was going on. And if you look at the scale, the vertical scale on the left-hand side of both of these graphs, what you're going to notice is the one on the right only goes to 4 versus the one on the left that goes to 20. And what this tells us is that these participants all thought that by the second day of having their sleep restricted, that they had adjusted to that sleep schedule, and that nothing really changed for the remainder of those 14 days. And none of them scored higher than 2, or thought they scored higher than 2 errors when they were subjectively asked to give their opinions. So when we look at the actual objective data versus the subjective data, it's very, very clear. We will always overestimate our alertness and underestimate our sleepiness, simply because we're impaired at judging our own impairment. So what it comes down to is we need to figure out how to manage fatigue correctly. And that's going to be a combination of 2 things. It's a shared responsibility between the organization, who has to look at work schedules, workloads, and work environment, and the personal situation. The individual has to show up fit to work. That means they need to come well rested. They have to obtain the sleep that is afforded them. They have to manage their lifestyle, and they have to manage any health and medical disorders that could further impact their fatigue.